All right, so this part of the design theory is going to be a movie of me going through some designs from professionals out there and talking a little bit about some of the theories, the design theory that they use, their elements and principles that they use within these. Now, I'm not going to go through all of the things that are within each of these designs, but mainly just point on some of the main things I like to talk about in each of them. And then you can go ahead and, challenge yourself and go through some of these and see if you can point out anything other than what I've talked about as well. And hopefully by the end of this, you'll be able to go through other designs and begin to be aware of how these design principles are used, and also look at your own designs and begin to use them as well. So let's go ahead and start with the company called Ahoy there. Now the first design I'm going to talk about here is one that is a symmetrical, it's symmetrical in design, and oops, there we go, sorry about that. Let me go ahead and move that off. It's symmetrical in design, and then some of the other things that I'd like to talk about as well with this one, let me just go ahead and move this out of the way, sorry about that, is just about how they've used lines for, oh, sorry, basically shapes, I should say here in this one. Shapes that they've started to do things like use space and depth in them just slightly, where they've done something where they've shaded on some of them and others they haven't. They've just texturized. Now also what I'd like to also point out is that the rhythm that they've created using their elements of design. They've used the principle of rhythm and really repeated a lot of these shapes. Of course, it's symmetrical, so there'll be repetition on each side. But then the flow that they've created with similar similar colors within some of these objects, and then also organizing them to create a direction around the piece using size, variation, etc. This next one by Ahoy there is also a symmetrical design. It's radial, which means that sort of basically by the center we have sort of, well actually it's not quite radial, it's mainly just symmetrical. I apologize for that. But really what I'd like to sort of mention here are the elements that they've used. Again, they have lines, they have this sort of stacking of lines that, and then the starting from a wider end over here and going to a narrower end suggests direction or movement with these stacks of lines. Also some texture that they've created with some smaller shapes and variation in size of shapes here. The larger ones obviously don't create much texture, but the smaller the shapes are together, they create somewhat of a texture that's used. Now there's a slight little bit of shading, especially in this area, that creates some depth. And then one other area that I'd like to talk about here is the rhythm that's created as a principle. They've paid attention to a rhythm where they have sort of this grouping of repeated elements or shapes that create a flow with then causing direction with a next element that's in line. So for example, right in this area we have repeated elements, shapes that come into these lines that lead up here and then have a flow of a design that kind of leads down and around into this mouth area. Or you can think of it also here as a repeated shape. We start here at the mouth. I'm naturally want to go to the mouth of this design and start these elements on the outside, and they flow out and around and back in, and then sort of causing for a as my eye kind of leads around with the shapes that are repeated here, I have a flow of these curves that kind of lead my eye up to recognize those, and then have a repetition of these diamond and rectangle shapes as well. Now also creates sort of a harmony is a similar colors that are used throughout. So we have this peach that's repeated, and then the browns as well. So these are some things to start to observe. Let's go ahead and move on to the next artist. Alberto Saveso, I believe is how you would say it. Apologize, some of these pronunciations may be wrong. So for this one that Alberto has, his first design, is really, let's talk about mainly here, we have a person with some shapes layered over, okay? So we have our shapes and we have our element, which are elements of our design, so not only a person, but also these little petal shapes over her. We have some texture that's created, sort of slight texture in the background. As another element. Now, one of the things that I like to talk about that's interesting about this design is the balance principle area, where we have an asymmetric design here, but then also how the girl is also, we have another balancing factor, which is actually how he's decided to place or have the girl stand as a balance to create sort of a tension or suggestion of movement within this design, this balancing here. So again, we have a asymmetric balance, which means we don't have the repetition of shapes on either side. And then also one thing I'd like to go ahead and mention is just the fact that we have the body is naturally sort of sectioned off into that golden rectangle that I talked about. So we have sort of the head and then upper torso, and then also this lower area as well. So if we talk about sort of upper torso as being sort of stopped about right here, this would be our 3, and then the below the lower torso would be 5, so 3 to 5 ratio here, about the way this is separated. Again, we have movement and direction based on how she's standing. So you could think of this as a shape or lines of the body causing movement through the piece and then back around. So we have some very sort of rounded movements or repetition of this movement that creates, again, we have repetition is usually seen within rhythm and then also within sort of the harmony area of the principles as well. So that's with the first one. This next one I chose because of the contrast of this image that kind of demonstrates negative space. And then talking about how these shapes are repeated and then also shaded to create an illusion of depth. So this would be the atmospheric part of elements when we're talking about depth, and atmospheric again refers to sort of the change of shading as we go back further in a composition, so that would deal with the shadows, and then also this darker area here where we're back further on the face versus this upper area of the nose where it's about quite a bit brighter. Now, when we're talking about that shapes, shapes can be created with positive space where these white shapes are laid in, or also shapes within negative space. So we have this black area that's considered the negative space. And just a reminder that positive space and negative space are equally as important. Another little thing I'd like to mention is although he has mainly this sort of face that's made up of shapes, we also have a few lines here that suggest sort of this movement or rhythm throughout the piece, not only with these shapes but also with these lines that kind of come out and create that sort of movement. And not only is this nice to have repetition, but it's also nice to have sort of a variation once you have so much repetition to kind of get your viewer to be interested. All right, so this next one here is Carolina Mellis, and now she has this poster here that again I want to kind of talk about. We have some shapes in here. We also have some lines that are created with text. And overall, this dominant element, speaking of sort of principles and then dealing with principles and allowing us to organize our elements here, we have a dominant element, this child here. And the reason I've chosen this as the dominant element, now you might disagree, but it's really caused by this tension or this sort of suggested movement with these lines and again the tension of having the hands hold up this idea of a swing. And so that creates that automatically your eye is interested in this piece. And then around this dominant element we have our sort of our movement that's created with the organization or the rhythm of our elements, and it's really circular if you kind of notice how that sort of circles in around that dominant element to cause sort of even more of a sort of standout-ish area here for us to look at. Now our next one by Carolina Mellis is a linear design, and when we have lines that really move in a direction, for example, these sort of start down here and move up, and these lines are emphasized with direction based on the pointing of this finger. Whenever we see pointing, our automatic response is to look in that direction. And so our main composition is driven by these movements or the direction of these lines through the composition. And then we have sort of this element that floats back and kind of takes us back down and around to the bottom here again. Now with this, with the movement of the lines or the direction of the lines, we've created a unity or harmony, which is a principle, and kind of causing the idea of the unity or harmony area of continuance, or continuity, if you would kind of want to say that, where we have sort of a direction that's implied and our eye then continues to follow that. We also have somewhat of a golden rectangle here. Again, we have sort of this from the fingertip down as a composition where it's the 5, and then up here is a 3 section. So 3 to 5, again, ratio. Next we have Darren Hopes. And Darren Hopes is very interested in he uses a lot of texture in a lot of his designs. So this one specifically has a lot of texture and then linear movement with these common elements that create a line that moves down. These are more of the dominant element, I would say. We automatically, our eyes go to these repetition of lines, rhythm of lines, and that kind of lead us down into our subdominant areas here of our bike, and then we can lead up to this house as well. So we have our dominant elements that kind of lead us into looking at our subdominant elements, which is important, and then possibly looking to the background, which is our subordinate element as far as in the principal area here is how that's arranged. We have also one little note is how we have direction or sort of these corners that are made, these arrows that are made from the lines that kind of come down and then these shadows that come out pointing to the right. Again, this points us to the right, but then if we come back up and around, these are almost sort of arrows that point down toward this corner and then back up and around to the bike. So begin to realize how our principles help us organize our elements to kind of take us around our designs. Next one by Darren Hope here is one that's very interesting as far as just the way that he's composed it. It's obviously very it's very asymmetrical in composition, but what takes us around here is the direction of our combination of our textures here that create harmony with the repetition of these lines, and then the repetition or sort of similarity here causes us to kind of group around this area, but then the direction and how they point out makes us lead out of this area here into this other part of the design. And then we have these tiny little subtle dots that kind of bring us back around. And you can even see that he's created a little bit of a depth to this composition with a shadow, a slight little shadow behind this person character that he's made. We also have the golden rectangle here. If we kind of look to where we see predominantly our composition over here in the 3 area, and then our 5 area kind of extends past over here. So again, 3, 3 to 5. All right. Now the other thing I'd like to say is the direction of the woman's face, this person's face here, is kind of pointing out in this direction. But again, we have these lines that kind of takes us over here. But again, we have these lines that kind of point us back in this area. And then this sort of negative space that brings us back and down around in this area too. So even though we look off in this area, we come back around with negative space in these linear lines here. Next one, dust. Dust is interesting in that completely different style, a little bit less texturized. But we have this area here that this is our dominant area, and then we have our lines and textures within these shapes here as well. So the similar textures, these lines make similar shapes that are filled in then here in these areas that are filled in with texture. So we have lines and then we have shapes filled with texture that are similar. And this sort of area here brings us out and around to our sort of subdominant areas. These lines help us flow through and create movement again, which is great. The elements here are arranged based on sort of you would think of a harmony or sort of rhythm within them. Again, repetition and similarity is usually very much seen in the areas of rhythm, and then also in harmony within the similarity traits of harmony that helps us flow through this design. All right, next one. I picked this one out just mainly because it's one is an asymmetric design. It's sort of interesting because we have some textures here. It's very simple, but we have some things here going on. We have one that shows very sort of depth with shadows, and then also these very flat elements. But the way the direction falls here, we see this sort of, this I see as more of the dominant element than this blue because it's more stark and sort of, again, because it looks like it's popping out of the page, we automatically kind of go to that. And then it points down and to this area of sort of, I don't know, is that meat or something? And then repetition of shapes here. And then this direction of this line here, this diagonal line, creates movement that comes back around to this element. Now the other thing that I'd like to kind of talk about here is the contrast that's created with just purely the content here. We have this sort of spoon shape and this meat shape. What does that mean? It kind of sparks interest in the viewer, wondering what all this sort of stuff means, juxtaposition or contrast of ideas here. So, all right, now I'm going to have another video started here and talking about another bunch of designs.